actually wanted to start with a story. It's another one of those moments, probably I imbued Cynthia Enlow's influence, and that's what happens.
Oh gosh, I'm so sorry.
No, it's appropriate that the lights went down, because when you hear the story. So, when I was about 13, my best friend and I sat at the bottom of my garden in suburban Johannesburg. The sun was going down. That's why the lights going down was appropriate. And we had a misshapen candle burning between us, one of those that you got given at Christmas and you saved forever. And we were discussing with intensity, as one does when one is a teenager, the depressing state of the world in which we found ourselves. I don't know exactly what was going on at the time that concerned us so much, but I was growing up in apartheid-era South Africa, so no doubt, and I'd become a little bit politically active, so I'm sure there was something about another state of emergency or news of wars elsewhere. But there were many adults around me who saw the problems of South Africa and the world, the political situation, as it was called, as deep and intractable. And that really filled me with frustration and despair, because when you're 13, you don't like to be told that there's not much you can do about it. And as we sat there, we asked ourselves, you know, why can't every country in the world just send a person, and that all the countries in the world can have one person, they can go to a great big meeting, and then they can sit down and fix everything. I'm not really sure where this came from, why I thought this was a good idea, but it did seem blindingly obvious to me. And I can't remember the further details, but I do remember going to my father later that evening and telling him our plan, you know, after he'd found our garden candlelit hideout, and him saying something along the lines of, Angel, that sounds like the UN. It already exists, and it doesn't really work that way. And that evening may have been, in fact, the last time I spent time thinking seriously about the United Nations, until nearly 20 years later when I accepted that job at WILP. I'd just completed my LLM, as Carol was saying, and the job, when I first took the job, it was because I was too chicken to go and do a PhD, actually. And it seemed like a way where I could get some practical exposure and to my research interests and try and integrate things, because I never quite liked the idea of being either an academic or an activist. That never made a lot of sense to me. And I felt I had an understanding of the issues around, or at least some of them, around women in conflict, and I considered myself a feminist with some theoretical and activist grounding, but I knew almost nothing about how the UN worked. It wasn't an institution, I can tell you, that the apartheid government covered in the school syllabus at all. And I think that my knowledge of peacekeeping was mainly limited to these spoof movies that were made in South Africa about the blue helmets in Namibia and their exorbitantly expensive Land Rovers. But that's really about all I knew. And I didn't really know what I was supposed to do when I went to work, nor did I really know what it would mean to take my feminism into that institution. So I then spent 5 years doing policy advocacy and mostly came out intact. And I learned a lot about the UN and about feminist theory and practice. I discovered early on, as many of us do, that my dad was right. The UN and Security Council policymaking was nothing like the reasoned and orderly environment I'd imagined, in which state representatives came together to talk and where they wanted to solve the world's problems, and they sat down and did so. Aside from the many actors engaged in the process, the level of complexity far exceeded anything I could have contemplated. And there was no book I could read to figure out what to do. I remember finding a book in our office on Security Council protocol, and I read it, well, no, I didn't read the whole thing. I started to read it, and it didn't seem to help me very much either. There were just all these arcane rules, and but it seemed like there were some rules of the game that I did need to learn, and I learned quite quickly. I learned that advocating for and monitoring policy really meant that you had to go to an endless string of meetings. And at those meetings, there was an unspoken protocol about who sat at the table, who sat at the seats against the wall, that determined how people were addressed, if you actually addressed them by name or by title, and in what order and how many of them. And I learned that the best policy pitches came in the form of really good questions that nuanced arguments are politically risky, and that being outspoken and critical was actually often deeply appreciated by government or UN system insiders who felt constrained by their own positions. I learned that successful advocacy involved interactions with governments over coffee and cigarettes. I have since quit, but it was very useful at the time, and in hallways between meetings. And that these informal interventions were spaces where persuasion was practiced and influence exerted. I learned that gossip and rumors from informal moments often made it easier to respond effectively to political opportunity, and that good timing was often more important than the substance of arguments. I also learned the astounding influence exerted by individuals behind the scenes, and the discomfort of being an insider and part of an elite, conflicted between a feminist politics of inclusion and a desire to take advantage of political opportunities that were fleeting. But I also learned that this discomfort at how feminist politics or theory bumped up against practice was not unusual. I certainly wasn't the first to experience it, nor shall I be the last. And I learned that a feminist politics made space for many incompatible approaches to the world. Ending militarism was certainly part of my feminism, but it was far from a priority for many of those with whom I had to collaborate. I learned that a feminist approach that we learn about in class can be incredibly frustrating in practice. I learned almost off by heart the Marge Piercy poem about the 14th subcommittee, which all of you should go and look up at some point. It can take 3 days to put together 2 paragraphs of a letter, and that might involve behind-the-scenes teeth gnashing, rolled eyes at the political naivety of newcomers, or frustration at those who said nothing until just about when you were going to print the letter, and then they decided that something that they really cared about hadn't been addressed. In short, then, I learned, as I was supposed to be, was expected, that the experience of policymaking bore little resemblance to the world of my naive 13-year-old imagination. But what I didn't expect was the disconnect evident between the world of policy practice and the many feminist academic critiques of policy, of feminist policy. Critiques that provoke profound discomfort and frustration amongst many feminist policy actors, often as much for what they left out as for what they said. And a desire to think through this disconnect is basically what has really come to fascinate me and what I'm focusing on in my dissertation work. And I'm in the initial stages of that project, so what I'd like to talk about today is thinking about, well, the heading was up there, so I was going to point to it, but it's gone. It's back, there we go. This focus on sexual violence in conflict and how we might think about that. Is it a failure? And if it is indeed a failure, which I don't want to spend too much time on, how can we think about these failures in ways that might help us do better critique and better policy advocacy eventually? I have none of the answers yet. Catch up with me in 3 years. Hopefully I'll have a few. So it's often thought that one of the most significant successes of feminist intervention into international security policy was the recognition in 1325 that women in conflict are could be something other than victims and demand something more than protection. But over the last several years, there's developed somewhat of a crisis in the community of activists and scholars concerned with this policy over the way in which understandings and representations of this woman in conflict have evolved within this policy discourse. And it's argued that these have begun to undermine the success of recognizing women as something other than victims. And I'm interested in exploring ways in which we might think about these failures, as I was saying, and their emergence out of what are initially seen as successful feminist interventions. Because I think how we account in feminist critique for this disjuncture might help us understand something about what the possibilities and risks are, and that you maybe can't have one without the other when you intervene in a space like the Security Council. Of course, there have been many kinds of feminist engagement in international politics and policy. Academic critiques have been really important of state-centric, patriarchal approaches to international law, of international relations theory, but there have also been other activist efforts that haven't necessarily made it into the pages of journals, but have been important for finding spaces for women's voices and gender issues. And a key way that the influence has happened within international law and institutions is through these policy interventions, right? Through trying to influence policy to achieve particular political projects or to insert something into the practice of institutions. And we all know in the 90s there were particularly significant results in this regard. There was the fight to have violence against women recognized as a human rights issue saw success, for example, in the adoption in Vienna of the UN Declaration on the elimination of violence against women. And within the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the links between gender inequality and militarism were reflected. On the institutional level, the effort to have the concept of gender incorporated into the work of institutions like the UN and the World Bank has, at least on the surface, been really successful. Many feminists have said that not a single institution has really failed to introduce these concepts at this point, and that elements of feminism have been incorporated into political and institutional life at the international level. And for many of these outcomes, these policy outcomes, they are the success that people were seeking, but their subsequent fate has been far more complicated and decidedly less positive. And I read an article recently, it was written a few years ago, but it really struck me. The Feminist Project in international law, this critic said, is losing ground even as many are celebrating its victories. Now, the underlying assumption that there is one feminist project whose predetermined goals are not being met is worthy of critique, but I'm not going to interrogate that here. But these critiques do reveal that policy or institutional outcomes have been disappointing at different times. I'm sure many of you have read the many accounts of what has happened with gender mainstreaming. You certainly have a preeminent expert in the room. The adoption of this very powerful and well-theorized concept within spaces like the UN has, it is argued, become depoliticized, and its feminist intent and content have been basically stripped as it's become institutionalized. And a similar fate, many aver, has befallen the Women, Peace and Security agenda. So 1325 was adopted in October 2000. It took another 8 years for the Security Council to issue another resolution. And since then, there have been 6 additional resolutions. Now, I left after the fourth one. I've sort of a little bit lost track. I can't keep all the numbers going anymore. We used to put 1325 on t-shirts and other articles of clothing, but people are running out of space at this point. The criticism, though, is that many of these, so 1820, 1888, 1889, I think 1960, all deal with sexual violence and conflict. And for many, this is seen as detrimental to the long-term feminist agenda. And in the process, a comprehensive and nuanced understanding of sexual violence and its connections with political participation and with militarism have been lost in this policy. So it's not just that there's a focus on sexual violence, but that the way this focus has manifested, this nuance has been lost. Then we get to the point of saying, okay, so how do these failures happen? And that's what I want to spend a little bit of time on rather than too much focusing on the resolutions themselves. When people look at policy failures, you often hear things like, and it's a sort of shorthand often, feminist goals have been co-opted, gender's been turned into a technocratic tool, it's been instrumentalized. Others would say that hegemonic forms have taken over, which is a hard sort of thing to say in the policy environment. Hegemony is not a word that goes down well. Others will say that, oh, it's powerful actors who dictate the terms of the debate, or that those working on the inside have simply abandoned the struggle, which is the one that gets me the most. And many of these critiques, don't get me wrong, many of them are correct in terms of the outcomes that they describe. a depoliticized notion of gender, for example. But I don't think they really help us think carefully about the possibilities for future feminist engagement with policy. And I think that in thinking about alternative narratives of failure, we do need to take seriously that these interventions are made in and through language. Now, those of you who are awake in the 1990s will be like, oh no, it's not another postmodern moment. Well, I mean, I guess IR theory has taken its time thinking about language in the mainstream, so it's still relevant. And language, I mean, that is the stuff of policy. It is that which policy is made of. So it is important that we think about language. It does, of course, rest in some way on the assumption or belief that if we get the words right, if we fix meaning in an appropriate way, or in some right way, that this will shift material conditions in a particular manner in the spaces where policy is implemented. And evidence in other contexts suggests that good intentions don't always make their way into implementation practice, and that conceptual understandings on their own won't necessarily take you so far. But if we assume for a moment that the aim is to get the words right, or ensure a particular feminist understanding of those words, what can we learn about how to do that if we think more explicitly about these policy interventions as attempts at meaning making, rather than just broad political projects, right? And there are many feminist critiques in this realm that take language seriously, and so there's really great work to go from. Some take the position that failures to sustain feminist ideas within policy can be attributed to the ways in which particular concepts in those policies are constructed or understood. Many of you will have read the work of Laura Shepherd, who's in Australia. She looked at the formation of 1325 in a book from some time ago, and she argues that the conceptions of international security and gender violence within the Security Council Resolution 1325 condemn that policy to failure in practice. But in these critiques, there's a sense that the problem to be addressed is a lack of appropriate or sufficiently feminist conceptualizations on the part of those doing policy work. That what is needed is simply to provide them with a bit of an education, the possibility of alternative concepts with which they can work. But it isn't clear to me that the disconnect between feminist conceptualizations and those that emerge in policy discourse can be traced to a theoretical or conceptual deficit on the part of those engaged in policymaking. On the contrary, it seems even those fully equipped with all the right meanings, all the appropriate meanings, can still face significant challenges in having those accepted in the first place and sustained in the long term. And this is not a problem that is unique to feminist engagements, right? Anyone who's interested in, I spoke briefly with someone before about human security or about the idea of social capital in the World Bank. All of these things, these concepts face similar challenges. And I found it quite useful to look outside of international relations, scholarship and politics, to the work of historians and cultural scholars like Williams, Koselleck, Skinner. They take political and social contestation over language really seriously, and they think about how that struggle happens and how it manifests. And they mostly deal with, and are very explicit about, the kind of language that they think is important. These concepts that become inescapable or irreplaceable parts of the political and social vocabulary in a particular field. And often they become crystallized into a single word, but they contain a range of meaning within them. So you can think of liberty, democracy, crisis, all of these things, right? And scholars like this focus their attention on these sort of long-range historical studies, but I think there's a lot to learn from them. And certainly in consensus-based policy-making environments, you're trying to get people to find some common denomination, right? You're not going to get, I think this is one of the first things to pay attention to, is you're not going to get people on this side and that side of the spectrum to accept one or the other's language in the first place, right? So there's a way in which you want to find language where everybody feels the most happy. And these kinds of concepts are somebody described them as a particularly spacious kind of hanger on which those of different persuasions are able to hang their coats, which I quite liked. Concepts that are malleable, elastic, and non-specific also allow policymakers some space into the future into which they can fit a range of concrete implementation programs. And if we think of the feminist policy interventions in the UN, many have taken this form. So you've got attempts to fix the meaning of particular signifiers as they enter new institutional spaces, like gender, for example, or to shift and expand the meaning of pre-existing concepts, as in the case of international peace and security. You know, what does that mean? When we look at women, peace and security policy, it's harder to find these concepts. I started out this work thinking about what are the concepts that matter to us in this way, and gender's an obvious one, right? International peace and security. But I came to realize that so much centers around the figure of the woman in conflict and who she is. And she emerges as an embodied person speaking on behalf of civil society at Security Council debates, but she's also the trope in policy discussions. And if you can claim the most authentic version of her, you get your position taken up. The woman in conflict comes out as an anonymous, gender disaggregated number in statistical accounts of victims of violence or holders of political office, as an individual who wants a particular mode of security, as someone whose body is injured and violated by men. She's also a refugee to whom humanitarian aid must be fairly dispersed, who wants to be able to join the military and fight in combat, who's a peacemaker and wants to rid a community of small arms and light weapons, who wants to be part of relief and recovery efforts, who should be at the peace table and making policy. She's a patient receiving care at a rural clinic in Haiti. She's a member of a support group for survivors of sexual violence in Bosnia. She signs letters demanding council action on the situation in the Central African Republic. And she makes demands of international security decision makers about decisions to invade countries or impose sanctions. She is all of these things in different moments. That's a lot for one woman to take on. But this figure is deployed in many ways. But the most significant one that we face again and again, in critique especially, is this idea that she is not simply a victim, but is an agent of peace in particular. And if we think about how many meanings have to come out in these concepts or these figures, I think the power of the ambiguity that we take advantage of, even if we don't always see it that way, is also where I think we need to cast our minds when we think about the vulnerability of linguistic interventions. And to perhaps also accept that there are inevitable risks, and there are no right words to ensure against this vulnerability. Linguistic intervention is built on inherently unstable ground. So the very openness and contingency that allows for language to be a space of contention also leaves it vulnerable to future contestation. We don't want to fix the woman in conflict as one figure, because there are many women in conflict everywhere who have different needs, interests, desires at different moments in time, right? So we have an interest in keeping this open, but that does mean that we face risks. And although we may manage to make particular meanings or systems of meaning hegemonic, they can't be fixed. So they're always vulnerable to whatever we exclude at the beginning. And they have to be actively and continually reproduced. I think if we go back to some of the feminist scholarship that maybe doesn't directly engage the practical and think about the need, I've been reading Derrida on the plane, it's maybe a bit bad for me, but really thinking about the need for persistence, right, and persistent engagement. And there are many feminist critiques that are doing exactly that. They're saying, look, the meaning is shifting, watch out, be careful, right? And that's what this moment is about. Watch out, be careful, we're moving too far away from the meanings that are going to be more helpful for this bigger project. But I think we have to think about how the meaning is created and reproduced in order to be able to analyze these shifts effectively. Otherwise, we misidentify the blockages. And there are a couple of moments that I've picked up in other critiques which, you know, when I read them, I was like, yeah, that's true, but, you know, that was often my reaction, right? So one of them is going back to Shepherd. I intend no ill will to Laura Shepherd. Her work is really great, but I'm picking on her now. She very usefully explores the women, peace and security discourse, and she examines what she terms the narratives of production of Security Council 1325. And she does this through analysing publicly available written texts, advocacy letters, reports of the Secretary General, and resolutions. And she argues that these key actors in the resolution's adoption deployed concepts in ways that contributed to a discourse likely to fail. One piece of evidence she brings is a letter from the NGO Working Group on Women, Peace and Security, which is a key advocacy coalition at the time. Well, I don't have the timing quite right, so I'll check with you on that. But there was a coalition of groups advocating for 1325. And there's a letter she pulls out which says, United Nations Security Council Open Session on Women, Peace and Security. And she critiques this for treating woman and gender interchangeably and assuming the terms to be translatable, and thus likely to result in programming that does not get at core problems. And this may be so, but I think there's something we miss by focusing only on the language in these texts. I've been very interested in looking at the work of Pierre Bourdieu and thinking about the social conditions of communication. Linguistic conventions are imbued with power and authority by factors and conflicts outside of language, but that manifest in language, right? And a textual analysis is not going to get at this. And so I thought I'd look a little bit at 1820 and some of the critiques of that. So one way that I've seen of critiquing the resolution is to see it as one that the Security Council decided to adopt when pressed for a follow-up resolution, and in which the Security Council, chose to focus on sexual violence and reassert its role as a protector of women rather than as a supporter of women's emancipation. On this view, the critique that the focus serves the institutional purposes of the Security Council by reinvigorating a narrative of gender that supports militarism and justifies the hegemonic use of power in a crisis makes sense. And maybe this isn't wrong, but what else can we learn about how to engage institutions if we think about policy not as emanating from a monolithic entity with a single malevolent intent, but rather as a result of an engagement in meaning-making by people within a particular policy community seeking to address a specific material problem and having particular institutional options available. In relation to 1820, the context in 2007-2008, many of you will remember, was increasingly worrying reports of extremely high levels of sexual violence in the Eastern DRC. But also, the stories were not forgotten about women in Bosnia, and there was still also a lot of violence in places like Côte d'Ivoire and Sierra Leone. And there are many arguments that can be made about how women are agents and not just victims, and how one should not exceptionalize sexual violence in conflict, or how one should not exceptionalize sexual violence over other forms of violence. And I agree with all of those. But who has to bear the transition cost of our understandings? Whose bodies have to bear the physical and emotional cost of those moments when we decide maybe we shouldn't pay attention, because if we pay attention in this way now, we're going to shift the discourse in a certain way. And at this moment, women in the DRC were asking for action from the Security Council. And I don't believe their views can simply be characterized, as one commentator has done, as valuable but simply reflecting a difference of opinion on how the goal to end violence should be realized, and merely productive of tensions between activism and critique that are feminism's lifeblood. I think in some moments we need to be able to say that protection is in fact what is needed in a particular moment, and then think about how we talk about that protection rather than saying let's not talk about protection. I think that avoiding the issue doesn't help us. And I don't think we should ever walk away from things because we want a pure theory and something that hangs together nicely. At that time, many of the countries where these problems were manifesting had UN peacekeeping missions. And the UN was, for good or bad in many situations, a body of authority and the only body that could exert any form of control. And there may be many problems, but that was the case in places like the Eastern DRC, right? And the problem was that although all this violence was happening, the peacekeeping missions were saying, yes, we know, but it's not in our mandate to do anything. Okay, now the mandates of the Security Council are issued by, the mandates of the peacekeeping missions are issued by the Security Council, right? They're resolutions of the Council. And a response from some of the members of the Council was actually an interesting lesson in successes of the women's movement, because certain Council members, including my own country, in less public fora, argued that, well, you had a great success and we agreed that violence against women is a human rights issue. And so you should go to the Human Rights Council to deal with your problems. For various reasons, principled and political, that wasn't a very comforting response. And then the Security Council members said things like, well, we don't have any credible or reliable information on which we can act. Now, anyone around in that time knows there was lots of information out there, but it wasn't the right kind of information, right? They weren't prepared to act on an Amnesty International report or a Human Rights Watch report or a Reuters news report, okay? The Council wants information in a Secretary General's report. That is the way, that is official information, okay? Now, so we said, okay, so how do we get information in reports then? And we thought about that a bit, which requires you following this like labyrinth in the UN to figure out how a report is written, because it is not simple. It is not simple at all. And despite the importance of issues affecting women being included in these reports, they were really just being left out. And some of the reasons for that, this is where we have to look at how things happen, right, is that the gender units within the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, even if they had the information, they were allocated maybe like one paragraph for gender in a word-limited report. Now, any of you who've written any paper with a word limit, you know how things have to be shaved down and what goes first, right? What goes first is the gender analysis, because everybody assumes that the Council is more interested in how many rebel soldiers there are on this border or that at any particular moment in time. But this was the problem, and we had to break a cycle, because if there was no information on sexual violence, then the mission wouldn't be mandated to address it when its mandate was up for review. And then if they weren't mandated to address it, they didn't get any money to look at it. And if they didn't get any money to look at it, they didn't look at it. And so it didn't make it into the report. And so you see, the cycle develops, the chicken and egg. And so we had to figure out a way to break that. And faced with this web, one of the necessary first steps was to actually figure out, what will Security Council members hear? You can say what you like, but they won't hear everything. Only some things are heard. And so we decided to argue that this wasn't a new obligation the Security Council had. Of course, there was 1325 already. And in fact, their mandate in the Charter, because the Charter, more respectable than 1325, right, said that they have to maintain international peace and security. And so our job was to, and this is where all of the wonderful feminist research comes in, right, to be able to establish how sexual violence and conflict unsettles societies in different ways, right, and how it threatens international peace and security. And ultimately that was the language that was adopted in 1820, was recognizing this link between sexual violence and conflict and international peace and security. Now, I'm not trying to defend 1820 I'm not trying to defend it in any way, and I'm also not trying to say that the focus on sexual violence is a good thing. I do think that that part of the agenda has moved forward and the participation parts have stayed stationary in some ways. But I've been reading, for fun, along with Derrida, Security Council open debates over the last few days, and reading through the meeting records. And it's been very interesting that, in fact, many of the governments are very aware of the need to reassert this participation aspect, right? And they're doing things like, if they mention all of different factors, they'll make sure to mention participation first, right? And then say something about protection later. So there is definitely awareness of this. It's not just this flat, they only care about sexual violence, which, if you look at the policy on its own, you might think, right? So I'm not defending this particular narrative that's coming out, right? But I think that it's not just about the powerful wanting to reassert a protection agenda, okay? On a practical level, this kind of work was necessary in order to get sexual violence addressed in peacekeeping and political negotiations on a practical level. It didn't really add anything new to the law. We already had international criminal law recognizing all these things. And it did come with risks. It emphasized the protection agenda, and it reinforces the links between sexual violence and the laws of war, and the permissible and impermissible forms of harm, and that implicitly accepts the inevitability of war. And so that is one of the risks that we take when we engage with the Security Council to achieve particular feminist projects. And I think the important thing, though, is that those choices that are both medicine and poison are ones that have to be made. And it's about ethical responsibility, and I think we have to make ethical choices as advocates, but I think you can't think through what is ethical and what is required ethically unless you're in a practical situation. I mean, the practice of ethics in pure theory is, I mean, there's nothing hard about that, is there? I mean, the whole thing with ethical choices is that they're hard, and they're hard to make. And I think we have to think more that it's in those small moments we have to think about what the choices are, rather than just critiquing at the meta level. So I wanted to sort of reveal some of the things that I think we can see differently if we look at meaning making, not just as words on paper, but also about what people do. And not everyone includes the idea of practice in their understanding of discourse, but I think if we don't, that we'll be missing a lot. So that letter I mentioned to you, where woman and gender there's this accusation that they used interchangeably and the working group wasn't really thinking straight. Well, so some interesting things about gender. Russia from time to time says things like, is anyone here who speaks Russian? Excellent, you can tell me if this is true. That there's no cognate for the word gender in Russian. There isn't. Okay, so they're right on that. Okay, good. Just checking. And so they prefer to avoid the use of the term. And when a permanent member of the Security Council makes this kind of objection, it's also very different from a non-permanent Security Council member making the objection. Their objection will disappear in 2 years' time. You don't really have to worry about it. A textual analysis can't explain that. It also can't explain that any debate, any NGO working group letter on a debate is going to use the heading that the Security Council uses for the debate, because you want the governments to know what you're talking about. So if it's called A, then you call it A, okay? And the title comes from whoever's holding the presidency of the council in the month that the debate is being held. And the presidency is allocated on a rotating basis alphabetically, right? So all of these things can be somewhat like chance. They're not necessarily like this evil, malevolent, singular entity, right? Down there making all these decisions. And these may seem like very minor details, but when you've got critiques that claim these titles to be indicative of a political position or hampering implementation efforts, then the details start to become consequential, because then maybe when you're doing advocacy, you pay more attention to detail in a different way. Shepard also talks about the Secretary General's reports. People refer to these a lot because they are the official reports. but I was quite horrified by how they're written when I sort of saw into some of them. And the UN system-wide action plan on women, peace and security that was analysed, I remember in 2007 or something, all of these member states in the debate were talking about this plan. I know that 3 people sat with a spreadsheet and we made stuff up. Okay, and that's not a good thing. I'm not proud of that. I mean, I was lucky to have a space in the room to try and get things going, but these things are all hidden. And I think we need to surface them if we're going to make critiques that help us think how to do things better. Reports are written by very junior people, and there's unspoken protocol. You don't criticize a member state in a written report to the Secretary General. You're not allowed to do that. It's just not on. Special, like independent experts can do that, but the Secretary General may not do that. He will get in a lot of trouble, and he will make you get in a lot of trouble. So critique is not really something you'll see there. I think, not to bore you with this, but I do think we need to look at all these social practices, and I mean, maybe it is about going back and sort of looking at the world out there as one big text, right? And everything is an interpretive experience. And I think a lot of the work that's gone on around discourse misses that part because it's so hard to access. I've spent the last 3 weeks trying to come back to my old job and get back in the stream. It's very hard, and I know people. So I understand how it happens. And this is not to say that, deny materiality in any sense, right? I'm not saying that it's all about language and materiality doesn't matter, just that the meaning of objects, actions, subjects, all of these things are produced within a particular discourse in a moment in time. And I think that the field in which they take place is also important. So we see a lot of discourse analysis that just thinks of like this entire world and does the analysis like that, rather than thinking about what are the particular practices, what are the particular individuals inside of a field, which is why I'm becoming friends with Pierre Bourdieu and thinking about different fields, how individuals are shaped. You have lots of different individuals in fields. What kind of backgrounds do they all bring to it that maybe shifts things? A lot of the NGOs working at the UN have got degrees from SIPA, from Colombia. A lot of the government people too. Do we need to get spies in there at some point? Shift how things happen at SIPA if we want things done. And I think it's figuring out, really digging down and uncovering the taken for granted understandings, the dispositions that guide how people act, how power is defined in the field. What counts as an advantage? Who makes a good advocate? Who doesn't? I was interviewing someone the other day who said to me, "You've got to dress the part." And this is from somebody who's actually very stylish and out of the box. And she said, you just have to, if you wear a suit, and preferably a dark colored suit, you will actually be more successful because you look like the enemy. You've got to dress like the enemy. And you will be, sounds silly, but I remember I went to my sister's wedding in South Africa, I came back with my hair braided. I definitely got some looks that didn't quite think I fitted in the room quite as much. So these are things I think we need to take seriously. Sort of finding the topography of the Security Council and then going from there. I think that exploring the logics of action are what are going to help us figure out what we need to take account of in future policy interventions. And I think they'll change over time, but I think once we sort of uncover or surface some of those things, because I think many people have ideas of what they are, we just don't write about them all that much. Anyway, I'll stop there.
I'm Jane Parpart. I'm one of those people who's written a lot of nasty things about policymakers who don't do what they say they're going to do. It's one of my specialties. But I've spent the afternoon working with one of my PhD students, Yulia, right here, I hope will ask you a question. And we were I was trying to explain why so often policymakers wind up making claims, particularly gender mainstreaming in my case, is what I'm analyzing. Why they're making claims that clearly cannot be achieved. And if you take a dark view of this, like I often do, you often see it as a way of pretending that something is going to happen when you know damn well it won't. But I was trying to be broad-minded to my student, I was thinking we could also consider the possibility that putting something on the agenda, even if you know that it will not succeed, at least not in the way you're stating you think it can, but that putting it on the agenda over and over may be a way of keeping an issue alive that is actually not possible to do in any short. You cannot gender mainstream into all institutions around the world. It's impossible to do even in 3 years, 5 years. It will take the rest of the millennium if it even gets close then. But so what do you think? Do you think that the policymakers are putting these actually unachievable goals into policy in order for a long-term goal? Or do you think they're putting them there just as window dressing to get them by the people, the critics who are saying, where's the gender mainstreaming?
So I think I hate this answer, but I think at different moments it's different. And I think that it also, I think there are a lot of people involved in policy and in writing the words who genuinely want this stuff to happen. I do think there are those folks out there, right? And who believe that at least if we get it on paper, it is a way to pressure. It's a way to create pressure, which is why we want to get things in policy in the first place, right? So that you can hold something up and say you've got an obligation. Sometimes I think that, I mean, the examples are not coming to me right now, but I think that, I think there are times like in those sort of really, the more people that are in the room, like when it's the General Assembly stuff and things get negotiated by 193, are we up to, or 94? Lost track of the countries too, that's bad. That when you're getting at that level, you've got so many national interests going on that people are eventually just coming up with this broad thing that sometimes doesn't even make grammatical sense, let alone, being something that's achievable. But I think in the Security Council there are plenty of people who actually want concrete things to happen. And other times where they want the approval of civil society, certainly in their home constituencies. And some countries who'll agree to things because they don't much care. Because some of them will be like, well, that's never going to happen, so I don't really care, so I'll put it in. I think it's all of these different things. Yeah.
My name is Zoe Marks, and I'm from the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard. So thank you very much for an interesting talk. I wanted to ask you a bit, so you talked a lot about the Security Council, and the way I understand those resolutions is that they're designed to pressure states and governments to do things, but the UN is obviously much, much bigger. So I was wondering what your thoughts are on the relationship between the rest of the UN, particularly the programmatic side, and some of the funds, and what's happening at the Security Council. And do you think that there's been an overemphasis on some of these resolutions and the sort of discourse-based critiques that you're talking about in feminist literature? It seems to me, I'll just express my biases, that there's not a lot on some of the actions that have been taking place, that there's actually as big of a gap in the policy making, in the literature and on the research side of things as there is in the policy making. We focus on things that are on paper because they're much easier to tackle, and applying that to what's actually happening in the field is maybe missing.
So let me just get the question. So the one part of it is what those resolutions, the extent to which they're looking at what states can do at the national level, but also what the system can do. And then the other part, I'm not sure I quite got, which is that, do you feel like in the literature there isn't enough about what actually does happen? Or that there isn't enough of a critique about how implementation happens? I guess the question's not so much
critique of the literature, which is a critique of, you know, the programming, but maybe just answer the first two questions and I can follow up with you later on the second.
Okay, so I mean the first part, I actually think that a lot of the Security Council resolutions, once you start looking for them, the big preambular paragraphs, often about the sort of grand ideas, right? When you start getting down to the operative paragraphs, a lot of them actually are directed internally at the UN. And peacekeeping.
Explain preamble versus operative.
So you've got, so when you look at a council resolution, which, you know, I have one in my bag if anyone wants to look at the end, because I carry them around with me. You know, reaffirming this and that resolution and recalling how important women are to this and all of those things, right? Those are just, they're the lead up to the action items, basically, right? When you get to the action items, this is another thing, when you walk around you talk about the PPs and the OPs and the operative paragraphs, the action items, you'll find a lot of them in the women, peace and security realm are directed at the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, and there are others that refer to sort of system-wide things. And where things are directed at national governments, you will find that the way that the UN programs work is with national governments. So if national governments are being asked or pressured to do, I don't know, have more women in peacekeeping, which is a pet peeve of mine, UN departments will then often work with the government on, or if think about like work with refugees, right? They're going to be working with host countries to do things, and so those host countries are going to need to be committed in certain ways. So I think they're ways that once you go beneath the language and see how they get taken, and also, you know, many UN, like people within UN departments will find pieces of language that they're ambiguous enough, and we've got to see that, again, the power of ambiguity, that they will find pieces of language that they decide this is the way that I'm going to pressure my department internally to do things, even if it doesn't explicitly direct action in that way. Does that sort of answer your question? I guess follow up with me, tell me more, like I'm happy to say more. I guess I was just interested in you extending your talk a bit to, sorry.
I was just interested in you extending your talk a bit more to the programmatic side and the implementation. I mean, you're sort of offering us a meta critique, right? A critique of the critique, which I think is really valuable from just a sort of conceptual perspective of what's happening with power and language and instrumentalizing even just the policy-making process to hopefully inch the agenda forward.
But I am interested in the policy-making process. That's why I'm talking about that. I'm not talking about the implementation process, and I'm not saying it's unimportant, but I am talking about the policy-making process, because it just gets brushed over as this black box, and I'm trying to get inside the black box.
Can I ask a follow-up question that is about the implementation, though?
I might not know anything, but you can try.
No, I want to know when you open the black box and you find what you've found, what are the implications of that for implementation? Or is it actually implementation is a case entirely apart, and what's inside the black box doesn't inform the way things are implemented?
No, I think that, well, the one thing is that governments are never going to put things into policy that they never ever want to see implemented. I think this goes to the earlier question, right? I think they're not going to put things in policy that they never want to see implemented, okay? But they sometimes defer the struggles into, like if you know that putting things in language a certain way now will tie you up in financial obligations, then you sort of act a certain way when you're devising policy, right? I think though there's this belief in the system, and I mean, why engage in policy otherwise, that if you get the words right, you'll get the implementation right, okay? And I'm interested in figuring out how people think they can get their ideas into getting the words right. That's where I'm at the moment. Yeah, and as I said, I don't have, I'm just thinking about opening this up rather than, I don't have any answers for you now. I'll check back in 3 years and I might. I saw a hand somewhere here. Was I dreaming? Maybe not. A chaser.
Just a chaser in this, in that there is some interesting work done by development anthropologist Tanya Lee at the University of Toronto and David Moss in UK, and both of them are arguing that the politics of policy making is something that needs to be studied. So they'd be very excited by what you're doing.
Yeah, thank you. I'll come and get their names
afterwards. Yeah, I can give you the sources. But then what Tanya Lee especially is arguing, that this notion, the Foucauldian notion of governmentality, whereby we look at policy to tell us what governments are trying, what kind of citizens governments are trying to create. That actually that's based on an assumption that the state can control that entirely. And so both David Moss, coming out of a big development project in India, he's from UK, and Tanya are pointing out that policies tell us a lot about what governments hope to do to create certain kinds of processes and certain kinds of citizens, but implementation is not the same as policy making. And that's another level that has to be studied in itself in relation to policy, but not read off policy.
I think that's right.
What she points out is that the weakness with governmentality as a notion is that it assumes that policy can control people, but people have their own agendas.
Right, and people are making
disruptive
and implementing policy.
Exactly.
I think we sort of also forget that sometimes.
Yeah, so they're calling for studying both, but not as if they were tightly linked, but studying the link through focusing on either one.
Yeah, no, because I'm definitely interested in like tracing as you look at one piece to see, okay, and then what is that kicking off somewhere else? But that's not my focus at the moment.
Hi, I was very excited to hear your talk because, as Professor Jane Parpart said, we just had a discussion about that. My name is Yulia Rashukina. I'm a second-year PhD student in global governance and human security, and I'm going to focus on how development institutions such as World Bank or UNDP mainstream sustainability or climate change into development. So I would be curious to hear from you, would you see any similarities or commonalities in the process of mainstreaming gender into development and mainstreaming sustainability into development? Would be, in your opinion, any patterns that you would encourage me to look at in comparison?
I'll give you, I've done some interesting reading about, because I think also the institutions matter, like what institution you're engaging with does matter. Like I think if you're getting things into the policy of the World Bank, you've got some slightly different currents that you're having to, that you're having to contend with. There's some really interesting stuff around getting the idea of social capital and sustainability into the work of the World Bank. I think that there'll be lessons about paying attention to certain things that could happen, like how things get used as tools, how people in bureaucracies are almost forced by virtue of what their jobs are to use concepts in instrumental ways. That's what they're trying to do a job and they have tools to do it. That's how it works. And so it's sort of inevitable that concepts that float by will be grabbed in that mode. So I think that there'll be lessons that you can probably get from like what are some of the kinds of things to watch out for, but I think the politics are quite different. I think the governments who care about it and why they care about climate change stuff versus why they care or don't care about gender can be quite different.
And the second question, you mentioned that you are not interested as much in policy implementation, you are more on the side of policy making, but before you were also talking that meaning is produced through policy making and practice, so how it correlates with what you said? That's
why I'm interested in the aspect of, I'm not interested in going and taking a piece of policy and saying, how is this implemented ineffectively or effectively? I'm interested in how these, when I'm talking about practice, I'm very much focused on the practice within this environment, but the practice of how those pieces of paper, these things are not, hermetically sealed. You can't, there'll be ways in which how things happen in particular moments influences even how policymakers are thinking about them, right? So it's like, I've sometimes said, I said to my advisor a couple of weeks ago, could I possibly do like a paper mache model, like one does of the solar system for my dissertation instead of writing it? Because maybe then I could have all the moving parts, fitting. Because, I mean, you're right, exactly, they're not separate things. But one has to have a little window for the purposes of this academic project, Like you can't think about everything simultaneously.
All right. My name is Amani Alja, and I'm a professor in the Women and Gender Studies department here. Bridging the scholar activist and the scholar policymaker divide has been an ongoing challenge for feminists. And you have kind of touched upon some of the critiques of that, given the fact that now you have experience in doing both. And as you write now, your PhD, and you touch about the literature and some of these kind of contested debates. I'm just curious to hear your own kind of reflections on how to bridge that divide, any kind of concrete
ways. Well, I think that I'd had some experience within the academic world working at a law school in Cape Town before I did this policy work, so I sort of think my brain was in all different spaces at once. It's interesting, like, when you it's like you feel like a little bit of an outsider in whatever environment you're in, right? When I was the director of PeaceWomen, I used to get asked to academic conferences as the token practitioner, right? And you'd be there and like everybody would have all these things with big words, and then I would come along, do my little, like everybody else thinks and I do. That was how I was treated. And so I think that I think that the notion that it's only academics who think and only policymakers who do is one of the things that we really have to address. And I think I felt most alienated within the academic world, definitely, yeah. I felt most treated like not being a good feminist in those spaces when I ask questions about, like, okay, so how do you make that actually happen in somebody's lived reality? Like how do you make, because policy is this kind of transition from, it's a very obvious place of transition from the ideas into implementation, right? But people implementing are also thinking. People, who are engaged in projects are also thinking. And so I suppose for me, what I really want to be able to do, and like this is just, this stuff is one project in my work, right? I'm not, good Lord, I hope to not be doing this forever. But I think just having, like, really respecting that everybody can do this different thinking piece. I think that will be the most help, and that because the academic world is its own field, right, with its own systems of reward and punishment and whatever, right? And so just got to defy those at every moment.